Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. We'll be discussing his new book called Prison Life Writing: Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System. Life writing is a literary genre, mainly nonfiction, that, as you might imagine, tells the story of a person's life, including formats such as diaries, memoirs, and autobiographies. Simon's book is part of a life writing series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of these episodes. In his book, Simon situates life writing squarely in the prison experience. He explores how prison life writing is influenced by institutional constraints, the notion that prisons at one time were intended to convert felons into more productive members of society, and the various ways men and women perceive their own transformations before, during, and after their incarceration. In this third episode, we dig into the complexities and limits of the conversion narrative and how women's prison life writing has taken on a very different perspective from men's writing. In Chapter 2, you discuss James Carr's autobiography, Bad, which, as you say, breaks the rules of prison life writing by utilizing African-American folk storytelling traditions in order to represent himself as a violent, hypersexual folk anti-hero, a character type that is common in prison culture but that rarely appears as a speaking autobiographical subject in life writing. What is the significance of this? Why is it important to represent all types of narratives in prison culture, not just the redemptive ones?
That's a really great question. So James Carr's autobiography, Bad, is kind of rarely discussed. It doesn't come up. It certainly doesn't come up as a work of literature worthy of discussion. And in a sense, that's for good reason. It's because Carr in his autobiography brags about violence. He brags about murder. He brags about rape, both inside and outside the prison system. And at no point does he really say, I used to be, he doesn't use the conversion narrative in the conventional way. He doesn't say, I used to be this horrible person. I've now seen the error of my ways and I've transformed. He sort of uses it a little bit at one point when he describes himself following in the footsteps of George Jackson. And he was a close friend of George Jackson's. And by kind of doing that, he kind of frames himself as a revolutionary as well and tries to represent himself as a revolutionary. But then he becomes very disillusioned with that narrative, especially after George Jackson himself was kind of viewed as a martyr figure by the kind of leftist movement at the time. Now, George Jackson's experience is much more complicated than that. But for Carr, he saw Jackson as merely being a kind of puppet of the left and somebody who was convinced that once he was released, there would be a wide-scale revolution, a kind of overthrow of the white supremacist and capitalist system, and that just wasn't the case. And so Carr becomes disillusioned with this. And so in his book, you have him really describing with relish all of these horrible acts of violence. And so for most people, it's understandably a book then that's just worth kind of not looking at and not addressing. But the reason why I think this book, there's several reasons why I think this book is important. One is that if you look at the genre of prison life writing, the vast majority of them are talking about and representing people who've transformed themselves in ways that make them seem amenable to a kind of wider audience, right? They become nicer, better people. That then makes them, it kind of follows, in a sense, this trajectory in relation to the prison that in many ways we would like. It's somebody who's kind of changed themselves, they become better, they're no longer violent, they've renounced their former ways. And yet, on the one hand, that we should be suspicious of that narrative because that's the story that occurs in prison discourse. That's what the prison is ostensibly supposed to do. It's supposed to transform people. But also, not everyone in prison is like that. And there is also, perhaps more so on the left, a risk of idealizing incarcerated people as merely victims. Now, I'm not saying that many incarcerated people especially incarcerated people, racialized incarcerated people, are not victims, especially of a kind of wider system of injustice. And that includes James Carr. As a Black man living in the United States who went through the foster care system, somebody who's really experienced racialized violence in many different shapes and forms. And yet, you also have people like James Carr incarcerated who are violent and have been violent within their own communities, whether that violence is direct against somebody else, whether it's burglary, whatever. And so it's much more complex when we think of if we're trying to represent the lives in the prison system. I think, in a sense, it's important to represent the lives in their totality, and that includes people who we may not want to engage with. We may not want to hear their story. And yet, in a sense, it's for a variety of reasons, I think it's important to hear those stories. Now, with James Carr, when you look at his autobiography, what I see is that you have somebody who has rejected the narrative of that's sort of prescribed to him by the prison system. He doesn't go, or doesn't want to go, from being a criminal to an upstanding citizen.
Right.
Because in many ways, he understands that as a false narrative. He also rejects the narrative of the revolutionary. As I mentioned, he sees that as a false narrative as well, one that ultimately he sees as doing real violence to his friend George Jackson. So where does that leave him? If he's trying to write his autobiography, he's trying to tell his story. As an incarcerated or formerly incarcerated person, you don't have a lot of room to move. You don't have a lot of choice in terms of narratives that are available to you. So what Carr does, which I find fascinating, is he essentially braids the kind of prison narrative with a very old folk tradition within the African American community. And this is a tradition that goes far back 19th century, goes back to stories of enslaved people. And it's the story of the bad man. So the bad man is this figure who is, hyper violent and resists at all costs, right? Resists the institution at all costs, usually even involves violence to them and often their death as well. But also, this is somebody who is unstable in terms of their own community, also does violence to their own community. Now, you see this in, murder ballads, for example. You see this in songs like Stagger Lee. The story of Stagger Lee who, meets Billy, shoots him down, ends up in some cases of the story going to hell and taking over hell, beating up Satan and so on. So you have this long tradition, one that also you see in hip hop very often. This kind of idea of the bad man is central to a certain figure in hip hop. So you have this long tradition within African American culture and African American folk art, and you have bad in bad. You have that tradition, I think, being used as a way for him to represent as fully as he can the kind of person that he is. Right? He represents himself as a bad man in this really hyper aggressive way, somebody who is joyously fighting the system, but also somebody who is, in frightening ways, joyously abusing the people that are around him. So you have this kind of, I think with bad, if you simply look at it as a story as somebody who is really reprehensible and somebody who's therefore not worth looking at, I think you miss all of the different cultural textures of a book like that. So in many ways, I think that's the other reason why paying attention to something like bad matters. Now, one little caveat that I think is also important is that bad is a story that's an as told to narrative, right? So Carr tells the story to two young white men, and in the moment when they're trying to figure out how to tell this story, one of these guys is kind of describing it in the introduction, right? He says, we couldn't figure out how to get Jimmy or James Carr to tell his story. He was like, he couldn't figure out how to tell it. And so we decided to use this technique that he had told us about when he was incarcerated, which he called lying, where somebody would start telling a story in prison and then everyone else would say, stop lying. That's not true. That's bullshit. Yeah. And it would make the storyteller go bigger and bigger with these stories. The stories become more grandiose, more wild. And they found that that was a suitable way for them to tell that story. Now, that story of lying is part of that bad man tradition. It's very much part of prison culture. And so, interestingly, we have this book, which is, comes out of this storytelling practices in prison that we don't often see in other published monographs. But also, it's a story told to two white men. And so that raises questions, about race, about the way that a black man is represented in literature. Now, James
Mm-hmm.
Carr, may have been perfectly okay with the way he was represented in this book as this hypersexual, violent bad man. And yet, I think we also want to ask ourselves about how much agency he has in that storytelling process. And what's the role of what we would call, or what John Sikora calls, rather, the white envelope in the telling of his narrative, right? His story is there, but it's a story that's told to two white guys, right? Who are then editing that story, reshaping that story, and then publishing that story. Interestingly,
Mm-hmm.
also after James Carr is murdered. And so that raises all sorts of complicated questions of race and power as it's relayed through prison life writing.
Okay. Excellent. In your book, you touch on how imprisoned writers use the conversion narrative somewhat to their advantage, whether it's perhaps to get their work published. It's easier to convince a publisher to print your writing, if you can distance yourself from your previous self and crimes. But I'm curious to see if whether there are narratives in prison life writing that are left behind because of this. And I suppose, in a sense, bad, because it's like people are kind of setting it aside because they don't want to, shine a light on Carr's behavior. But perhaps stories that never even made it that far to publication. How does the use of the conversion narrative constrain prison writing in this case?
Yeah. Again, it's really hard to tell, because I think in many cases, and again, this is for men's prison life writing, women's prison life writing is different.
Yeah.
But for men's prison life writing, for published monographs, it seems like the conversion narrative is the kind of key to accessing readership. It seems like, it's, and I think it's in part because that's what we've learned to expect from prison literature,
Yeah.
that a prisoner's story follows a particular trajectory. And I think we also want to ask ourselves, obviously, like, what's the ideological work that's doing? Why are we expecting this? How does this engage with, our expectations around the criminal justice system, etc.? But I think the conversion narrative becomes one of, like, I think for imprisoned people, to be able to tell their stories, there's a really kind of narrow band within which they have to work. They don't have, if they've been incarcerated, and they're either still incarcerated or they've recently been released, they don't have a lot of narratives that they can draw from. And I think that publishers and readers, expect a certain story. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the conversion narrative becomes one way of essentially accessing that readership, accessing those publishers. So kind of, what's left on the cutting room floor? I think a lot. I mean, if we think first of all of education, having the capacity to be able to write an autobiography is something that is not available to the vast majority of incarcerated people. That's partly why you have so many as told to narratives in prison life writing,
Yeah.
because you have somebody, an amanuensis, who will take that spoken narrative and then transform it into a published autobiography. But you just don't have people in general who have access to writing in general. So I often wonder, you know, like to what degree is the genre of prison life writing really letting us know about experiences of incarceration? Like, what are its limitations?
Mm-hmm.
In part, in simply because, as I said, there's such a narrow portal through which that experience can reach a readership.
Yeah. So you've been careful at a couple of points during the conversation so far to point out that we've been talking about the male perspective in prison life writing. So I want to get to the women's perspective and talk about how the forms that kind of life writing shows up in, and how institutional expectations for female incarceration are different, and how that impacts perhaps what they write about.
Yeah, I was really surprised that women's prison life writing rarely, almost never featured the conversion narrative.
Hmm.
And I initially wasn't sure what to do about that. I like the whole thing I was focusing on was this relationship between the institutional narrative, the way the prison system was using the conversion narrative as a kind of central way of defining how prisoners, in some cases, could be released. Right? If you remember how I talked about George Jackson,
Right.
and how George Jackson, the only way he's going to get out is if he represents himself as somebody who's been transformed, and transformed in a way where he'd be recognized by the parole board as somebody who's been transformed. And so the conversion narrative subtly plays a role in all of these different ways that incarcerated men represent themselves, and then especially represent themselves then in literature. And so I was really surprised. I looked at women's prison life writing and I thought, I don't see conversion here. I see many people who would be certainly suitable for a conversion narrative based on their lives. Somebody like Asada Shakur, for example, goes to prison, is somebody who's essentially a political prisoner, who manages, in a great kind of example of daring do, escapes from the prison system, goes into hiding, and eventually appears in Cuba, and is still in Cuba to this day. And the American government continues to try and extradite her.
Hmm.
So you have somebody whose story could very easily fit a conversion paradigm, and yet her story doesn't follow that structure. Likewise, Susan Rosenberg's an American radical, a political prisoner in my own country, also somebody who has a similar experience that could fit a conversion paradigm, and yet they don't. So for me, that was confusing. And then I thought, well, the thing that makes the conversion paradigm so central to prison life writing is in part because it's required by the institution. That these are people who are living in an institution that is at the core of its rehabilitative mandate is this idea that somebody has to transform themselves from a criminal into a citizen. And so that creates the pressure, the kind of discursive pressure on prisoners to kind of reproduce some version of that narrative in their life writings.
Hmm.
And yet in women's institutions, there's a very different story at work there. So women's institutions, which emerged after men's prisons. So men's prisons were established, again in the early 19th century, and women who were incarcerated, not in their own separate institutions, but when they were usually in institutions that were connected to the men's institutions, right? And then you have in the later 19th century, you have these reform movements that emerged that were focused on women. And so you have the first women's only institutions emerging in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century. And their focus was really on efforts to take fallen women and transform them into, for lack of a better term, the angel in the house, right? To
Right.
try and make somebody better suited for the domestic sphere. So that kind of transformation is very different. So in the men's institutions, it was an effort to take somebody who is a criminal and put them in a position, transform them in such a way that they could participate in the public sphere, and education becomes central to that. However, women's institutions, very different story, one that does not require the same kind of transformational rhetoric, but the idea is to kind of return women to the home. Now, the focus of those institutions becomes on women's sexuality. One of the central ways that those institutions were trying to change women was to change their their supposed promiscuity, to try to change them from into women whose sexuality was solely for marriage.
Hmm.
And so you have sexuality, a really kind of central focus of those early institutions. And I would suggest it's a focus that continues and plays a major role in women's institutions thereafter. And what women's prison life writing focuses on, perhaps not coincidentally, very often is sexuality. Sexuality plays a role in women's prison life writing in a very different way from men's. So if sexuality comes up in men's institutions, which it does, it's almost always sexual violence. So imprisoned men raping imprisoned men. And it's a kind of violence that's usually described from like a kind of an outsider's position, right? Somebody knows about this happening, or somebody intervenes in that happening and protects somebody else. There are exceptions. James Carr's autobiography would be an exception, for example. But it's almost never ever a kind of a kind of way for men to relate to other men in a positive way. Sex between men in prison is almost always represented as violence. Now, there are some rare exceptions. There's a book called Fish that describes a gay man coming out in prison. And yet, even then, even though there are some examples of loving male desire, the vast majority of that book is focused on the horrors of him experiencing sexual violence. But with women's prison life writing, sexuality can be a form of liberation. It can be a form of, take political forms. It can be a form of resistance. It can be a kind of channel for community building. And so when I looked at women's prison life writing, it was fascinating to me that, again, you have a kind of discourse about sexuality that is, part of the superstructure of the discourse of the prison system. And then you have that appearing in different ways in women's prison life writing. But one way that it appears is as a form of resistance, women picking up that narrative, changing it, and using it in a different way.
You just heard from Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor at the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia, and is the author of Prison Life Writing, Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of this series. Join us next week for a conversation about the evolution of the U.S. prison system and how prisoners' narrative techniques evolved right along with it. We'll also talk about why, frankly, the tradition of prison life writing should no longer exist.
What I'd like to say is I'd like to see this genre not be around anymore.
Yeah, right.
And it's one of the things the Black Lives Matter movement is really focusing on is the role of the criminal justice system in maintaining white supremacy and its attack on Black lives and its attack on Black communities. So I'd love to be able to say, in 20, 30 years, we're no longer going to have a tradition of prison life writing. We'll have a tradition of people who are treated fairly within a criminal justice system. And so this story that we see will somehow disappear. I would love to see that happen.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.